Number 10. Poverty Point, the ancient earthwork city built without kings. In the flat lowlands of northeastern Louisiana, long before the rise of the Maya, long before Cahokia, and long before most people imagined North America had anything like monumental architecture, a vast complex of earthworks appeared beside the Mississippi floodplain. Today it is called Poverty Point, but the name gives no sense of its scale or its challenge to the timeline of civilization. From above, the site reveals huge curved ridges, mounds, open plazas, and carefully arranged spaces covering an enormous area. It was built more than 3,000 years ago by people who left no writing, no known kings, no palaces, and no obvious army of forced labor. Yet somehow they moved earth, shaped landscape, gathered people, and created a remarkable ancient center in North America. And what makes Poverty Point so unsettling is the kind of society that built it. The old model said monumental construction required farming surplus, centralized authority, rulers, taxes, and strict hierarchy. First came agriculture, then cities, then monuments. Poverty Point breaks that expectation. The people who built it were not full-time farmers in the classic sense. They lived through hunting, fishing, gathering, trade, and seasonal resources, yet they organized labor on a scale that should not have been possible for a society without kings. The earthworks show planning. They show coordination. They show people returning to the same place again and again to reshape the ground itself into something meaningful. The ridges are the most famous feature, 6 large, crescent-shaped earth formations arranged around an open central space, and they may have supported houses, gatherings, markets, rituals, or seasonal occupations, but their exact purpose remains debated. Nearby mounds rise from the flat landscape, including massive forms that required huge amounts of basket-loaded earth to be carried and placed by human hands. Every basket was lifted by someone. Every layer was packed by effort. Every mound represents repeated decisions made by a community that saw value in building something larger than survival. That is what makes the site feel almost impossible. It looks like planning without a state, monumentality without a king, and a civic center without the usual signs of a city. Poverty Point was also connected to a wide world. Objects found at the site came from distant regions, stone, minerals, and raw materials carried across hundreds of kilometers. And this means the people there were part of exchange networks, stretching far beyond the local landscape. Goods moved in. People may have traveled there for gatherings, trade, ceremonies, marriages, alliances, or seasonal events. Poverty Point may not have been a city in the later urban sense, but it was not isolated. It was a center of attraction, a place important enough that distant materials and distant people found their way to it. That is where the timeline begins to crack. If hunter-gatherer societies could build places like Poverty Point, then complexity did not require the same path everywhere. North America had its own forms of organization, sacred landscapes, labor systems, and ways of creating community before the arrival of written records. Civilization does not always announce itself with stone temples or royal tombs. Sometimes it appears as raised earth, arranged space, shared memory, and a plaza where people gathered beneath the same sky for reasons we can no longer hear. The mystery is that we still do not know what held the system together. Was Poverty Point a trade hub, a ritual center, a seasonal gathering place, a permanent settlement, or all of these at once? Were the mounds built for ceremony, status, astronomy, memory, or social identity? Did leaders direct the work, or did shared belief make command unnecessary? The site gives us shape but not speech. It gives architecture but not law. It gives evidence of organization without telling us the names of those who organized it. The people of Poverty Point built a landscape of meaning, then vanished before history could explain what it meant. That is why Poverty Point belongs among the archaeological finds that broke the timeline of civilization. It proves that monumental building was not limited to farming states, kings, and written societies. It shows that people living outside the classic centers of ancient civilization could still coordinate labor, move materials across vast distances, and transform the earth into a social and sacred machine. The old timeline expects complexity to arrive wearing a crown. Poverty Point arrived in baskets of soil carried by hands whose names are gone. And in those ridges and mounds, North America left a warning for anyone who thinks civilization has only one path. Some societies built history without writing it down. Number 9. Atlit Yam, the drowned village beneath the Mediterranean. Off the coast of Israel, beneath the blue water of the Mediterranean, there is a village that should not be underwater. Atlit Yam was once a living Neolithic settlement built on dry land, close to the shore, where people raised animals, grew crops, dug wells, buried their dead, and built in stone before the sea moved over everything. Today, the site lies several meters below the surface, preserved in a drowned landscape that looks less like a ruin and more like a warning. It reminds us that some of the most important chapters of early civilization may not be buried under desert or jungle. They may be under the ocean, hidden by the same rising seas that erased the coastlines where people first learned to settle. What makes Atlit Yam so powerful is the level of preservation. The archaeologists have found stone houses, walls, hearths, animal bones, plant remains, tools, graves, and one of the oldest known wells in the region. A well is not a casual feature. It means people were staying long enough to invest labor into the ground, long enough to control water, long enough to build a permanent relationship with place. These were not wandering groups leaving a temporary camp behind. They were a community tied to land, water, food, animals, and the dead. They had already crossed one of the great thresholds of human life, the decision to remain. The burials make the village feel even more human. The dead were not carried away and forgotten. They were placed within the settlement world near the living, in a landscape that held memory across generations. Some remains show signs of disease, suggesting that settled life carried new dangers. Farming and herding created food stability, but they also brought people closer to animals, waste, crowding, and infection. Atlit Yam does not show a simple triumph of agriculture. It shows the cost of it. The first settled communities were fragile experiments where water, sickness, ritual, and survival existed side by side. Then there is the stone circle. At Atlit Yam, standing stones were arranged around what may have been a freshwater spring or ritual water source. The image is haunting, stones placed with intention around water in a village that would later be swallowed by the sea. We do not know exactly what the structure meant. It may have marked ritual, community gathering, water worship, seasonal memory, or something we no longer have words for. But it proves that this drowned settlement was not only practical. Its people were building meaning into the landscape, and they were not just surviving beside the coast, they were making the coast sacred. The disaster that ended Atlit Yam is still debated. Sea levels were rising after the Ice Age, slowly swallowing ancient shorelines across the world. But some researchers have suggested that a sudden tsunami may have helped destroy the village. Whether the end came slowly or violently, the result was the same. The sea took the settlement. Houses, wells, graves, tools, and ritual stones were covered by water. A place where people had built permanence became unreachable. The living had to leave, and the dead stayed behind beneath the waves. That is why Atlit Yam breaks the timeline of civilization. It shows that some of the earliest settled worlds were coastal, and coastal worlds are the ones most likely to disappear. So this old story of civilization depends heavily on what survived on land. River valleys, dry deserts, stone monuments, and cities that remained above sea level. But early people were drawn to coasts because coasts offered fish, shellfish, fresh water, movement routes, and fertile ground. If those places drowned, then the archaeological record is biased. We may be studying the survivors of sea level rise, while missing entire landscapes where early complexity first took shape. Atlit Yam forces us to imagine a lost map of prehistory. For every drowned village found, how many more remain hidden under sediment, coral, mud, and shifting currents? How many early wells, graves, houses, boats, shrines, and coastal gathering places lie beyond ordinary excavation? The sea is not empty. It is an archive, but it is an archive that hides its pages beneath pressure, darkness, and salt. That is why Atlit Yam belongs among the archaeological finds that broke the timeline of civilization. It is not famous because it has a king, a palace, or writing. It is powerful because it shows an early settled community frozen under the sea, proving that the coastline was one of humanity's first laboratories of permanence. The village drowned, but it did not disappear completely. Its stones, wells, graves, and silent ritual circle still wait underwater, reminding us that history may have begun on shores that no longer exist. Number 8. The Dispilio tablet, the wooden signs older than expected. In northern Greece, near the shores of Lake Castoria, archaeologists found a small wooden object that should have decayed into nothing thousands of years ago. It came from the Neolithic lake settlement of Dispilio, a place where people built homes near the water, used wood, clay, bone, stone, and plant materials, and lived in a world far older than classical Greece. The object does not look like a temple, palace, or treasure. It is a wooden tablet, darkened by age, preserved by wet conditions that protected it from the air. But carved into its surface are signs, marks, and lines that made it one of the most unsettling artifacts in European prehistory. Wood almost never survives. Our picture of the ancient past is shaped by stone, bone, pottery, and metal because those materials endure. But early societies also used wood, leather, fiber, bark, and cloth, the fragile materials that usually vanish. If the Dispilio tablet had been exposed to ordinary conditions, it would have disappeared and no one would ever know it existed. That means the artifact may not be unique. It may be one surviving fragment from a lost world of wooden records, symbols, and messages that time destroyed almost completely. The marks on the tablet are what make it controversial. They do not look like random scratches. They appear arranged with intention, as if someone was placing meaning onto the surface. Some have suggested they could represent early symbolic communication, perhaps counting marks, ownership signs, ritual symbols, or even a possible precursor to writing. And if the boldest interpretation is correct, then people in Neolithic Europe were using structured signs far earlier than the accepted rise of writing in Mesopotamia and Egypt. But the tablet does not give enough to prove that. It stands between symbol and script. That uncertainty is what makes the find powerful. Writing is often treated as the line between prehistory and history. Before writing, people are silent to us. After writing, they speak through names, laws, prayers, accounts, and records. But the Dispilio tablet suggests the boundary may not be so clean. Human beings may have tried to make memory visible many times before one system became durable enough, widespread enough, and lucky enough to survive. Some attempts may have recorded numbers, seasons, goods, ancestors, or stories. Most may have vanished because they were written on materials that rot. The lake settlement itself matters. Dispilio was not a world of isolated wanderers. It was a settled community tied to water, fish, plants, animals, houses, tools, and repeated occupation. People living there had reasons to mark, remember, count, claim, or communicate. A lake village has resources to manage, relationships to maintain, exchanges to track, and rituals to repeat. Even without kings, cities, or scribes, a community can need symbols. The old timeline expects writing to emerge from administration and state power. But perhaps the impulse began earlier, with practical and sacred marks understood only by the people who made them. The most disturbing possibility is that Europe may once have held many such symbolic systems, and almost all of them disappeared. A mark on wood does not survive like a mark on fired clay. And a sign scratched into bark, painted on skin, carved into a post, or tied into fiber can vanish without leaving a trace. Archaeology may be reading a library after nearly every page burned. The Dispilio tablet may be one page that escaped by sinking into wet ground. If so, it reminds us that the absence of early writing may be the absence of preserved material, not the absence of human thought. This does not mean the tablet proves a lost advanced civilization or a complete writing system older than Sumer. That would be too easy. Its power is more subtle and more unsettling. It shows that Neolithic people were capable of structured symbolic marking, and that the development of writing may have been less like a sudden invention and more like a long series of attempts, most of them forgotten. The tablet does not rewrite history with certainty. It weakens the certainty of the history we thought we knew. That is why the Dispilio tablet belongs among the archaeological finds that broke the timeline of civilization. It is a small wooden object from a lake settlement, but it raises a question large enough to disturb the boundary between prehistory and history. What if humans were trying to write before writing survived? What if the first steps toward recorded thought were carved into materials that time erased? The tablet sits in silence, its signs still unread, reminding us that the beginning of civilization may not have been written first on stone or clay, but on wood, and almost all of that first memory may have rotted away. Number 7. Chankilo, the solar observatory, before the Inca. In the desert of coastal Peru, long before the Inca built their empire and long before many people imagined the Andes had precise astronomy, a line of 13 stone towers was raised along a ridge. At first glance, Chankilo looks like a ruin broken by heat, wind, and time. Walls, platforms, corridors, and structures scattered across a dry landscape. But the 13 towers are not random. They form a carefully spaced sequence along the horizon, and from special observation points, the rising and setting sun moves across them through the year like a giant calendar written in stone. This was not a simple monument. It was a machine for measuring time. What makes Chankilo so unsettling is its age and precision. It was built more than 2,000 years ago, long before the Inca became famous for solar worship and imperial control of the Andes. The builders understood the movement of the sun well enough to create an architectural system that could mark solstices, seasons, planting cycles, ritual moments, and perhaps political authority. The site does not simply show that ancient people looked at the sky. Everyone looked at the sky. Chankilo shows that they organized the landscape around it, turning the horizon into an instrument and the sun into a power that could be tracked, predicted, and possibly controlled by those who knew how to read it. The old timeline often treats advanced astronomy as something that belongs to later states, priesthoods, and empires. A large kingdom needs calendars, it needs harvest timing, tax seasons, festivals, labor organization, and sacred dates. But Chankilo shows that careful solar observation existed in Peru long before the best-known Andean empires. That means the roots of astronomical knowledge in the region run deeper than the cultures most people remember. The Inca did not invent the sacred sun from nothing. They inherited a world where earlier societies had already learned to bind authority, agriculture, and ritual to the movement of light. The 13 towers create a haunting image because they make the sky readable from the ground. At one end of the year, the sun rises near one end of the tower line. At the other end, it reaches the opposite side. Between those extremes, day after day, the sun shifts its position along the ridge. To someone trained in the system, the horizon would not be empty. It would be full of dates. The desert itself became a clock. Stone, shadow, and sunrise became a language. And whoever controlled that language could tell people when the season had turned, when rituals should begin, when fields should be prepared, and when the community should gather. That is where the timeline begins to crack. Chankilo suggests that monumental architecture, astronomy, and social power were already intertwined before the famous civilizations of the Andes reached their height. The people who built it were not merely surviving in a harsh desert. They were constructing a relationship between sky and society. They may have used solar knowledge to legitimize leaders, organize ceremonies, or predict agricultural cycles in a land where water and timing could decide survival. In a dry environment, knowing the seasons was not an intellectual luxury, It was a matter of life, food and power. But the builders of Chankilo remain mostly silent. We do not know their full political system. We do not know the names of their rulers, priests, astronomers or builders. We do not know the exact ceremonies performed as the sun crossed the towers. There are structures that suggest defense, gathering and ritual, but no written explanation tells us how the site was used or what myths surrounded it. The towers speak with geometry, not words. They reveal knowledge but hide belief. They show intelligence without giving us the voices of the people who possessed it. That is why Chankilo belongs among the archaeological finds that broke the timeline of civilization. It proves that precise sky watching, monumental planning, and solar calendars were not limited to the famous empires that later dominated history. Long before the Inca claimed the sun as a divine ancestor, another people in Peru had already built a stone horizon to follow its path. The site reminds us that civilization does not always begin where names become famous. Sometimes the deepest innovations belong to cultures that left no empire behind, only towers in the desert, still marking the movement of the sun after the people who read them disappeared. Number 6. The Malta, megalithic temples, stone monuments older than the pyramids. In the middle of the Mediterranean, on the islands of Malta and Gozo, there are stone temples that make the timeline of civilization feel unstable. They were built before the pyramids of Egypt, before Stonehenge reached its famous form, and long before the classical world turned the Mediterranean into the center of empires. Their builders left no readable writing, no royal chronicles, no named kings, and no clear explanation for why they raised such massive structures from limestone. Yet the temples remain. Enormous doorways, curved chambers, altars, carved stones, underground spaces, and sacred architecture older than the monuments we usually place at civilization's dawn. What makes the Maltese temples so unsettling is their scale. These were not small shrines made by a few families. Sites like Gantia, Hagarchim, Menadra and Tarxian required planning, quarrying, transport, shaping and repeated labor across generations. Some stones weigh many tons. Some walls are built from massive slabs arranged with a confidence that suggests a society deeply familiar with stone. The builders did not have metal tools in the later sense. They did not have the engineering systems of later empires. They were island people working with limestone, rope, rollers, ramps, memory, and organized labor, and somehow they created a sacred landscape that still dominates the islands thousands of years later. The temples also break the assumption that monumentality must follow the rise of large states. Malta did not have a known empire behind these structures. There is no pharaoh commanding labor, no palace bureaucracy recording rations, no army forcing workers into place. This old model says that monuments like this require centralized kingship, taxation and hierarchy. Malta complicates that model. The builders may have been farming communities, but they were capable of creating shared sacred centers large enough to bind whole populations together. Their power may not have rested in kings. It may have rested in ritual, ancestry, seasonal gathering, and belief strong enough to move stone. The design of the temples deepens the mystery. Many have rounded chambers arranged like a sequence of internal spaces, almost as if the visitor moved from the ordinary world into deeper layers of sacred meaning. Some contain carved spirals, animal reliefs, decorated slabs, and evidence of offerings. At Menajdra, alignments with the sun suggest that certain temples may have marked solstices or equinoxes, linking architecture to the movement of light across the year. That the builders were not simply stacking stones. They were shaping experience, darkness, passage, sound, sunrise, sacrifice, and memory. The temples may have been calendars, womb-like spaces, ancestral houses, ritual theatres, or gateways into a sacred world we cannot reconstruct. Then there is the underground side of the story. The hypogeum of Hal Saflieni, carved beneath the earth, reveals a society that did not only build upward. It built downward into darkness, creating chambers for the dead, ritual spaces, and echoing rooms where sound behaves in strange ways. Thousands of human remains were found there, suggesting that death, ancestry, and sacred architecture were intertwined. Above ground, temples gathered the living. Below ground, chambers held the dead. Together, they suggest a religious system far more complex than the simple village life often assigned to early island societies. But the people behind this world vanished. Around the middle of the 3rd millennium BCE, the temple culture declined or transformed. The great building tradition stopped. The old rituals faded. New populations and new cultural patterns appeared. We do not know exactly why. Soil exhaustion, climate stress, social collapse, disease, resource pressure, isolation or migration may all have played roles. An island society can become fragile when land is limited and systems grow too large to sustain. The same isolation that allowed a unique sacred culture to flourish may have made it vulnerable when conditions changed. That is why the Malta megalithic temples belong among the archaeological finds that broke the timeline of civilization. And they prove that before the most famous pyramids, before the written empires of the Mediterranean and island people had already built a monumental sacred world in stone. Their temples show organization without known kings, astronomy without written science, death ritual without surviving scripture, and engineering without the tools later civilizations used to define themselves as advanced. The builders disappeared, but the stones stayed. And on Malta, the timeline still has a problem. Someone was building the sacred architecture of civilization before history was ready to explain who they were. Number 5, the Varna gold, the world's oldest known gold treasure. On the shores of the Black Sea in what is now Bulgaria, a burial ground revealed something that should have belonged to a much later world. Archaeologists excavating the Varna cemetery uncovered graves from the 5th millennium BCE, older than the pyramids, older than the great cities of Mesopotamia, and older than the written histories that usually explain wealth, power, and rank. Inside some graves were beads, bracelets, axes, ornaments, and sheets of gold, worked with astonishing skill. The amount was unlike anything expected from prehistoric Europe. This was not a village trinket. It was a treasure large enough to force a question. Who had the power to own gold before kings were supposed to exist? The most famous burial, often called Grave 43, contained the body of a man surrounded by an almost unbelievable concentration of gold. Thousands of gold objects were placed with him, along with copper tools, stone artifacts, shells, and symbols of status. The grave does not look like ordinary mourning. It looks like a statement. Whoever this man was, his community marked him as different from everyone around him. His death became a display of power, wealth, ritual importance, or all three at once. In a world before written titles, the grave itself became the title. The gold did the speaking. What makes the Varna gold so unsettling is how early it appears. The old timeline often places major inequality after the rise of cities, states, palaces, and organized armies. First people farm, then settlements grow, then leaders emerge, then wealth concentrates. But Varna suggests that hierarchy could become dramatic long before the first famous civilizations wrote their own names. Here was a society where some people were buried with almost nothing, while one man was buried with more gold than anyone else known from that era. The difference between graves was not small. It was a visible divide between ordinary death and elite death. The gold also reveals technological sophistication. To shape, pierce, hammer, and polish gold required knowledge of materials and craft. Gold does not feed a village, plant crops, or defend a child from cold. Its value is symbolic, social, and sacred. That means the people of Varna already lived in a world where certain materials carried meaning beyond usefulness. Gold could represent sunlight, power, purity, ancestry, divine favor, priestly authority, or a mystery we can no longer name. Whatever it meant, the community understood it strongly enough to bury it with the dead. To place treasure in a grave is to sacrifice it. The gold could have been worn, traded, melted, inherited, or displayed among the living. Instead, it was locked into death. This suggests that the burial was not only about wealth, but about belief. Perhaps the dead needed gold in another world. Perhaps the community displayed power through the loss of precious objects. Perhaps the burial confirmed a social order by showing that one person could take treasure into the ground. The grave turned inequality into ritual, and ritual made inequality feel sacred. The Varna cemetery also shows that early Europe was not waiting for civilization to arrive from elsewhere, and the region had copper working, long-distance exchange, farming communities, maritime connections, and symbolic systems complex enough to create extreme burials. Shells and exotic materials point to networks across distance. Metal objects suggest specialized skill. The cemetery itself suggests that identity, rank, ritual, and power were already being organized in ways that feel close to later civilization, even without writing. Then the culture behind Varna faded. The people who created this golden world did not become a famous empire. Their symbols were not translated into a later script. Their rulers, if they had rulers, left no names. Their hierarchy may have collapsed, transformed, or been absorbed into later cultures. The gold survived better than the voices. The objects that dazzled the eye lasted for thousands of years, while the meaning behind them vanished almost completely. And that is why the Varna gold belongs among the archaeological finds that broke the timeline of civilization. It proves that wealth, status, metalworking, inequality, and sacred display appeared in Europe far earlier than many people imagine. Before pharaohs covered tombs in treasure, before kings wrote their victories, before empires made gold the language of power, a prehistoric community beside the Black Sea buried one man like the center of a world. We do not know his name. We do not know whether he was a chief, priest, warrior, ancestor, or something our categories cannot hold. But the gold around him still says one thing clearly. Power was already learning how to shine before history learned how to write. Number 4. The Shagir idol, the wooden god older than civilization. In the cold wetlands of the Ural Mountains, miners searching through a peat bog uncovered something that should not have survived at all. It was not stone, not bone, not metal, but wood. A tall carved figure made from larch, preserved by the wet, acidic conditions of the bog for thousands of years. Most wooden objects from prehistory rot away long before archaeology can find them. But this one remained, darkened by time, broken into pieces, covered with carved faces and geometric marks. It became known as the Shagir idol, and once its true age was understood, it pushed monumental art into a past far older than many expected. The Shagir idol is older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than the first cities of Mesopotamia. Its age reaches back to the early Holocene, to a world just emerging from the Ice Age, when many people still lived by hunting, fishing, gathering, and moving through forests, rivers, and wetlands. According to the old timeline, people in this kind of world were not supposed to be making towering symbolic monuments. Monumentality was supposed to come later, after farming, villages, social hierarchy, and large settled communities. The idol breaks that expectation. It suggests that hunter-gatherers were already creating sacred images on a scale that demanded planning, skill, memory, and shared meaning. The figure itself is unsettling. It stands like a wooden being from a lost mental world, with human-like faces carved into its surface and repeated patterns running down its body. The key marks include lines, zigzags, chevrons, and shapes that seem too deliberate to dismiss as decoration alone. Some researchers have suggested that the carvings may represent myth, territory, spirits, warning signs, cosmology, or a symbolic code we can no longer read. But no one knows. The idol looks like a message, but the language has died. It stares at us from a time before writing, carrying signs that once meant something powerful to the people who made it. What makes the Shagir idol especially important is the material. Because it was made of wood, it reveals a lost side of prehistory that almost never survives. If people carved a wooden idol this large, they may have carved many others. They may have built shrines, posts, masks, houses, ritual markers, and symbolic landscapes from wood that has vanished completely. And our understanding of early civilization is biased towards stone because stone survives. But for forest peoples, wood may have been the sacred material. The absence of surviving monuments may not mean they did not build them. It may mean time ate the evidence. The craftsmanship also challenges easy assumptions. The builders had to choose the tree, cut it, shape it, carve it, and create a figure meant to stand or be displayed in a meaningful place. That required tools sharp enough to work wood, and a tradition of skill strong enough to pass technique across generations. A monument like this does not come from accident. It comes from a community that understood form, symbol, and labor. These were not people waiting for civilization to begin. They were already building a world of signs. The peat bog adds another layer of darkness. Muckiness. Wetlands often served as strange boundary places in ancient cultures, locations where objects, bodies, weapons, or offerings could be placed between land and water, life and death, the human world and something beyond it. We do not know whether the Shagir idol fell, was abandoned, or was deliberately placed into the bog. But its preservation feels almost like burial. The same environment that swallowed it also saved it. The idol may have once stood in open air, beside water, among trees, seen by people whose stories are gone. Then it entered the bog, and the bog kept it while civilizations rose and collapsed above the surface of the world. That is why the Shagir idol belongs among the archaeological finds that broke the timeline of civilization. It proves that monumental symbolic art did not begin only with farmers, kings, temples, or cities. Long before those things, hunter-gatherers in the forests of Eurasia were carving towering figures with faces and signs that still refused to explain themselves. The idol is not disturbing because it is monstrous. It is disturbing because it reveals how much of early human imagination has vanished. If one wooden god survived by chance in a bog, how many others rotted away without a trace? The timeline breaks not because the idol answers everything, but because it shows that the missing past was probably much larger than the one we have found. Number 3. Karahan Tepe, the buried ritual complex, beside Göbekli's shadow. In the hills of southeastern Turkey, not far from the more famous ruins of Göbekli Tepe, another buried complex began to change the story again. Karahan Tepe is not simply a smaller copy of a known mystery. It is part of a wider prehistoric landscape filled with stone pillars, carved animals, strange rooms, human-like figures, and spaces built at a time when the old timeline says people should not have been organizing religion on this scale. For years, Göbekli Tepe stood almost alone in the public imagination, a single impossible monument before farming. But Karahan Tepe suggests something more unsettling. The impossible may not have been isolated. It may have been a network. What makes Karahan Tepe powerful is the date and context. This was a world before cities, before writing, before kings, and before the full agricultural societies that later shaped the Near East. The people who gathered there were still close to a hunter-gatherer way of life. Yet they carved stone, shaped ceremonial spaces, and returned to the same sacred places with enough consistency to leave architecture behind. That breaks the simple order many people learned. First agriculture, then surplus, then temples. Karahan Tepe hints that belief, gathering, and ritual may have pulled people together before farming fully took control. The site contains T-shaped pillars, stone benches, carved animals, and one of its most haunting features, a chamber with stone heads and upright elements rising from the floor, almost like a frozen crowd emerging from the earth. The imagery feels human and not human at the same time. Faces appear from stone. Bodies are reduced to symbols. Animals and people seem to belong to the same ritual language. We do not know whether these spaces were used for initiation, ancestor ceremonies, feasting, death rituals, seasonal gatherings, or myths spoken aloud in darkness. But the architecture does not feel accidental. It feels staged. Someone designed these spaces to shape fear, awe, memory, and movement. That is where Karahan Tepe begins to break the timeline of civilization. If people were building such spaces before the classic rise of villages and states, then the roots of civilization may not lie only in food production. They may lie in the need to gather around shared stories. A monument can bring people together. A sacred place can create obligation. A ritual calendar can make scattered groups return at the same time each year. Once people gather repeatedly, they need food, coordination, storage, and rules. In that sense, temples may not have been the result of settled life. They may have helped create it. The wider region makes the mystery deeper. Karahan Tepe belongs to a group of early monumental sites in southeastern Anatolia, suggesting that many communities shared related ideas, symbols, and building traditions. This was not one lonely hilltop built by an isolated group. It may have been part of a sacred geography, a landscape of ritual centers where different bands gathered, exchanged knowledge, formed alliances, buried memory, and created a world of symbols before writing could preserve any of it. If that is true, then the beginning of civilization was not one sudden invention in one city. It was a spreading ritual system buried across hills that archaeology is only beginning to open. Yet the people behind Karahan Tepe remain silent. They left no tablets, no king lists, no names of gods, no explanation of the stone heads or pillars. We cannot ask whether the figures were ancestors, spirits, gods, enemies, masks, or memories of the dead. We cannot know whether the chambers were places of worship, fear, transformation, or social control. The site gives us the stage, but not the ceremony. It gives us the stone, but not the voice. That silence is what makes it so haunting. The builders clearly understood what they were making. We do not. That is why Karahan Tepe belongs among the archaeological finds that broke the timeline of civilization. It shows that the world before farming may have been far more organized, symbolic, and socially complex than the old story allowed. The site does not merely stand in Göbekli Tepe's shadow. It expands the shadow, turning one strange monument into evidence of a larger lost world. Long before written history, people in southeastern Turkey carved stone, shaped chambers, gathered in sacred spaces and built a landscape of meaning that still refuses to explain itself. Karahan Tepe reminds us that civilization may not have begun with the field or the city. It may have begun with people entering a ritual space, standing before stone faces and believing something in the darkness was watching back. Number 2. The White Sands Footprints, Humans in America. Too early in the desert of New Mexico, inside what is now White Sands National Park, the ground preserved something that should have disappeared almost immediately. Human footprints pressed into ancient mud. They were not bones, not tools, not painted symbols, not a settlement buried under stone. They were steps. Bare feet moving across a wet landscape near an Ice Age lake, surrounded by the tracks of mammoths, giant ground sloths, camels, and other animals from a world that no longer exists. Footprints are usually temporary. Wind erases them, water softens them, time destroys them. But here, the ground hardened around a human presence and held it long enough to break one of the most important timelines in American prehistory. For decades, the familiar story said that humans entered the Americas near the end of the last ice age, after ice sheets began to open migration routes from the north. The exact date shifted as new evidence appeared, but the overall model kept human arrival relatively late. Then White Sands forced a deeper question. Some of the footprints have been dated to roughly 23,000 years ago, placing humans in North America during the last glacial maximum, when massive ice sheets still covered the northern continent, and the traditional migration routes should have been blocked or nearly impossible. If the dates are correct, people were already far south in the Americas thousands of years earlier than the old timeline allowed. That is what makes the footprints so powerful. Tools can be debated, stones can be argued over, And a shaped flake might be called natural by one researcher and human-made by another. But footprints are different. A human footprint is direct evidence of a body in motion. It records weight, direction, stride, balance, and presence. It is not a theory of occupation. It is a person walking. At White Sands, the trackways include adults and children, suggesting not just isolated explorers, but real human groups living within the landscape. These were people moving through mud, carrying burdens, perhaps gathering food, following water, escaping danger, or crossing familiar ground in a place they knew. The children's tracks are especially haunting. Many of the footprints appear to belong to young people, reminding us that this was not simply a migration of heroic adults pushing into a new continent. It was family life. The children walked, ran, wandered, and followed others across the shore of an ancient lake. Some tracks show movement that feels almost ordinary, almost playful, until the age of the ground returns the horror of distance. These children lived in an America filled with megafauna, ice, changing water levels, and dangers that would erase their world completely. They left no names, no language, no stories we can hear. But their feet touched the mud, and the mud remembered. White Sands breaks the timeline because it changes the scale of the unknown. If people were already in New Mexico 23,000 years ago, then they had to arrive earlier than that. They had to cross, move, adapt, and spread before the footprints were made. That opens the possibility of coastal migrations, earlier inland routes, or movement patterns that left little evidence because rising seas later drowned ancient shorelines. It also means that the first Americans may have lived through long periods of isolation, climate pressure, and ecological change before the better-known cultures appeared. The peopling of the Americas becomes less like a single opening gate and more like a long, complicated story with missing chapters. The find also reminds us how biased archaeology can be. A stone tool might survive, but a camp of wood, fibre, hide, and memory can vanish. A coastline used by early migrants can now lie underwater. A hunting ground can be buried under dunes. A family path can disappear unless the conditions are almost impossibly perfect. White Sands survived because wet sediment, minerals, and time aligned in a rare way. It may not be the only evidence of early people. It may simply be one of the few places where the Earth kept the record. That is why the White Sands footprints belong among the archaeological finds that broke the timeline of civilization. They do not show pyramids, temples, writing, or gold. They show something more basic and more devastating to old assumptions. Humans were there. They were walking through North America when the accepted story said they should not have been. A few tracks in ancient mud forced researchers to rethink migration, survival, and the deep age of human presence in the Americas. The footprints are not grand monuments, they are quieter than that. But they carry the force of a direct witness. Someone stepped there in the Ice Age, and 23,000 years later, that step is still changing history. Number 1. The Blombos cave symbols, the mind that woke before civilization. On the southern coast of Africa, inside Blombos cave, archaeologists found evidence that the human mind had become dangerous long before cities, temples, writing, or kings. The objects were not monumental in size. They were small pieces of ochre, shell beads, bone tools, and carefully worked materials left behind by people living tens of thousands of years before recorded history. But on some of those pieces of ochre were deliberate engraved patterns, cross-hatched lines, repeated marks, and designs that looked far too intentional to be dismissed as accident. They were not a wall, a palace, or a written text. They were something older and more unsettling, signs that humans were already turning thought into symbol. What makes Blombos Cave so powerful is its age. But these markings reach back roughly 70,000 years or more, into a period when the usual timeline says civilization was still impossibly far away. Agriculture had not begun. Villages had not become cities. Writing would not appear for tens of thousands of years. Yet here were humans making objects that seemed to carry meaning beyond practical survival. Ochre could be used as pigment for body decoration, hide processing, ritual marking, or identity. Shell beads suggest personal ornament, social signaling, and perhaps group belonging. These were not just tools for cutting meat or scraping hides. They were signs of a mind that could imagine meaning and then place it onto the world. That is where the timeline begins to break. A civilization is often defined by buildings, states, records, and permanent settlements, but Blombos suggests that one of civilization's deepest foundations came far earlier: symbolic thought. Before humans could build temples, they had to imagine unseen forces. Before they could write laws, they had to understand that marks could stand for meaning. Before they could create kingdoms, they had to create shared identity. The engravings from Blombos may not be writing, but they belong to the same mental universe that would eventually make writing possible. They show that the human mind was practicing abstraction long before history had a surface to write on. The cave also reveals a level of planning and cultural memory that older models underestimated. A people returned to the site, made tools, processed materials, collected shells, used pigments, and created objects that were not purely functional. This means knowledge was being taught, techniques were being repeated. Symbols or styles may have been understood by members of a group across time. The people of Blombos were not simply reacting to hunger and weather. They were carrying traditions. They were shaping identity. They were using objects to communicate something that may have mattered socially, spiritually, or emotionally. The most haunting part is that we cannot read the marks. The cross-hatched patterns feel like a message, but if they were a message, the language has died. We do not know whether they marked ownership, memory, ritual, counting, territory, beauty, clan identity, or something that does not fit any modern category. To see, they sit at the edge of meaning, clearly intentional, clearly human, but sealed away from interpretation. That makes them more disturbing than a translated inscription. A written tablet can tell us a king's name. Blombos gives us a mind without a voice. And that mind may be the real beginning of civilization. Not the first city, not the first wall, not the first farm, but the first ability to make invisible ideas visible. Once humans could do that, everything else became possible. A mark could become a symbol could become a story could bind a group could build a ritual could become a temple could become a city. Blombos does not show civilization fully formed. It shows the ignition point beneath it, the moment when the human brain began creating worlds that existed not only in stone and bone, but in shared imagination. That is why Blombos Cave belongs at number 1 among the archaeological finds that broke the timeline of civilization. It reminds us that civilization did not begin when people first built monuments. It began when humans learned to make meaning survive outside the body. The engraved ochre, the beads, and the pigments are small enough to fit in a hand, yet they open a door into one of the largest changes in human history. Long before writing, long before cities, long before kings claimed to rule the earth, people in a coastal cave were already marking objects with intention. The timeline breaks because the mind was awake far earlier than civilization was ready to admit.